Thank you, Rawan, and I want to thank Sharq Diwan for your kind invitation to this session. I was pleasantly impressed with the title that you've chosen for your series. The civility, the concept of civility, is something that we are so much in need of at a time when barbarism, in the guise of so many different identities, actually presents itself to impose its mindset on our minds, on our souls, on our lives, on our institutions of education, on our power of imagination, on our dreams and everything. So I thought it will be good to talk about, in a larger context, what it means to try to reclaim a culture, the lost culture of civility, which I believe has existed across different cultural and historical periods. And this goes, in fact, against the commonly accepted idea that we have been constantly progressing towards things better in terms of material conditions, but also in terms of intellectual and moral principles. And I will try to challenge some of these ideas and see where we can come up with a new definition, or at least understanding, of the culture of civility and how it can guide our thoughts and actions in the 21st century. Let me also congratulate you for choosing this very nice title for your forum called Sharq Diwan. You have the two best things in the world: to have a divan in the Sharq, where the sun rises, where the light comes from. I guess that's a very big privilege. So know how valuable it is, because everybody's looking for a light and everybody's looking for a divan where ideas can be expressed freely. And let's also remember that when Goethe wrote his famous book of poetry, he called it the divan of the East-West divan. He was so much under the influence of Islamic poetry, especially Persian poetry, Hafiz and others. He chose the word divan, which is a beautiful word, of course, very difficult to translate into other languages. It expresses the environment almost like a festivity of different ideas, where scholars and people with open minds can come together and discuss so many different issues. And I hope this session will prove to be one of those sessions where we can exchange ideas and bring our minds and hearts together to address some of the pressing issues that we are facing. A few words of definition at the very beginning. First of all, the word modern, which I use in the plural here, barbarian, again, I use in the plural, and civility. What do they mean? At least what do they signify as they are used very commonly in our daily conversations? Modern, of course, refers to those who live in this particular age, but in the context of Western modernity, it has a specific historical referent. And it refers to the rise of modernity after the Enlightenment, after the French Revolution. Shortly, what happened in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe, culturally, historically, philosophically, scientifically, and other ways. That had obviously had a huge impact on the course of history over the last 2 centuries. And modernity came to define itself as an attempt to give individual human beings freedom and societies a degree of rationality. In the words of Max Weber, who I think understood modernity in some very subtle ways, the promise of modernity was to create free individuals and rational societies. And here, free individual meant that individuals were able to choose or make choices from among a number of choices that they were presented with. And perhaps the most privileged aspect and promise of modernity was to provide modern individuals or contemporary individuals with so many different choices of who they want to be, how they want to live, how they want to shape their lives, how they want to understand tradition, how they want to interact with religion, other cultures, how they want to have a sense of self-identity, how they want to shape society, and so on and so forth. So freedom came to be defined as an ability to make choices. If you are able to make choices, that means that you are free. Now, I'll come back to that definition because there are some tricks here that we have to be careful about. The second aspect of the definition of modernity was rational societies. And here, rational means functional. It means efficient. It means profitable. It means something that works. Because in the original sense of the word rational, here it comes from the word ratio, which means proportion. And if you get things in right proportion, then you can get things moving, functioning within a certain system. Again, in Max Weber's understanding of modernity, a rational society is one in which efficiency, profit, sustainability in relation to these two values are the key elements that keep a society going. So the promise was of modernity was to produce free individuals and rational societies. Now, Hegel made an interesting claim in the context of both defining but also shaping modernity, where he said tradition always emphasizes meaning, whereas modernity emphasizes freedom. The contrast between the two lies in the fact that modernity, tradition tells us that I can promise you a life saddled with meaning, a life based on meaning, that is a meaningful life, provided that you give up on some of your freedoms. That is, there will be some limitations on your choices if you want to have a meaningful life. According to Hegel, that was the promise of the tradition. Of course, the tradition here means, you know, the Western intellectual tradition, which included Greco-Roman ideas, but primarily Christianity, or the Judeo-Christian ethos of living a life based on the will of God, who provides people with a roadmap for their lives on this earth. In contrast, modernity, Hegel claimed, promises freedom. And freedom here means the ability to make choices. So moderns are distinguished from the traditionalists in their favor or choice of choosing freedom over meaning. Meaning is something you end up creating yourself. Freedom is your essential quality. What you do with that freedom is up to you. Modernity does not make any value judgments on what kind of choices you make. You may choose to be religious or non-religious. You may choose to be traditional or something else. You may choose to be this and that. You may make all kinds of different choices in your life. Modernity doesn't make any value judgments on the nature and the content of your choice. It simply enables you to make choices. Whereas tradition tells you that, no, if you want to have a meaningful life or a meaning in your life, then you have to have certain limitations in your life. You have to, in a sense, to use it, to put it in a kind of rather provocative way, you have to give up on some of your freedoms and liberties so that you can have meaning. Now, this dichotomy, which I believe is false, came to define the basic dynamic and tension between tradition and modernity in much of the European thought over the last 2 centuries. I say this dichotomy is rather fallacious and wrong, because we can have meaning in our lives without giving up on our freedoms. I can talk about this, for an hour, so I want to just keep it short here. But what I want to emphasize is that, of course, if you want to have meaning in your life, then you have to have certain principles, ideas, and limitations. Even for something as mundane as seeking to choose a profession. For example, if you want to be a doctor, a medical doctor, then you have to dedicate your life to at least 10 years of education, very intense training. You have to give up on so many other things. You have to give up on traveling, leisure, and maybe other things if you want to be a medical doctor. If you want to be a successful medical doctor, a famous one, a rich one, etc., or a good one at that, then you have to again, give up on so many other things. If you want to be an athlete, a successful athlete in any field of sports, if you want to be an engineer or scholar or philosopher or poet or painter, again, you have to set your mind to that goal and give up on so many other things. That ultimate goal defines your meaning. You want to be a painter, but then you begin to question, so what it means to be a painter, what it means to paint, what it means to be a doctor and help people, cure them, what it means to write a poetry, what it means to write a book on philosophy or history, enlighten people about certain ideas. All these things become part and parcel of your questioning. But something interesting happened, especially between the First and the Second World Wars in Europe. Search for meaning was declared to be a futile search. The nihilists claim that the world universe doesn't have any meaning. Modern science tell us, natural sciences tell us that the world doesn't have any meaning. The world is just an aggregate of physical, chemical components, protons and neutrons and things like that. It's something corporeal and material. It doesn't have any innate meaning. Meaning is something that we impart upon that world, something that we give to the world. That's the claim of the modern sciences, the nihilists said. Again, there are lots of assumptions to be questioned here, but the basic assumption was that the universe doesn't have any innate meaning, any intrinsic meaning. You have to make up that meaning as you go along. So basically, we live, according to this interpretation, in a universe which is devoid of meaning, but we are asked to find meaning in it. And that creates a paradox. How can you look for meaning in a universe, in a world in which there is no meaning? So you have to either look for that meaning within yourself, or simply agree with the claim of the nihilists, such as Albert Camus and many others, and maybe up to a certain point, Kafka and others, that you just have to learn how to live without meaning. Stop searching for meaning in your life, just live your life as it comes. The problem with that approach, of course, is that we are meaning-driven beings. We cannot live without meaning. We cannot do anything without giving some meaning, purpose to what we do. If I'm reading a book, I have to have a reason to read it. If I'm listening to music, deep down somewhere in me, something is responding to that music, and that creates the connection, which leads to of that piece of music. You know, if I want to be a medical doctor, help people, even if I want to make just money and nothing else, still, you know, that must be based on some purpose, some meaning for which I do that thing. Otherwise, you know, I'm no different from other beings such as animals or plants. I have to have some degree of meaning and purpose in my life. Therefore, search for meaning is an essential part of what it means to be human. We cannot run away from it. We cannot act as if we can live without meaning in our lives. If that is the case, then even the hyper-modernity phase of modernity in which we live at the moment cannot get rid of the question of meaning. But I cannot search for meaning without freedom. Therefore, I come back to my initial point that we can have meaning in our lives without necessarily giving up on our freedoms. We can still be free agents, make good choices based on meaning and purpose, and therefore have meaning and freedom in our lives. But now, in this late phase of modernity and capitalism, we are confronted with a very strange situation where we are presented with almost an infinite number of choices, but then we end up finding practically none worth making. There are so many different choices out there, but we feel like, you know, choosing any one of them doesn't give you the inner satisfaction, contentment that you are looking for. One choice leads to another. One alternative leads to another. And there is this almost infinite regress cycle of choosing one thing after another without ever getting the sense of satisfaction and contentment that you are seeking deep down within yourself. So moderns, which may include all of us in some sense, have this paradox of having freedom, so many choices, but not finding worth choosing anyone that will satisfy our search for meaning and purpose in our lives. Now, these moderns in the 18th, 19th century, when they were shaping the world, first in their minds and then in the actual world, needed the barbarians to justify much of what they were saying and what they were going to do. They needed the barbarians, especially when it came to the expansion of European colonialism to Africa, to the Middle East, to Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, where the barbarians served a very good purpose of providing moral justification for plundering other people's lands, riches, treasures, histories. Not only physical treasures, but also their memories, their dreams, their minds, their souls, their hopes, their self-esteem, their aesthetic, their histories, and everything else. Barbarians came very handy in India, for example, where the British could easily claim that the Indians, Muslim or non-Muslim, Hindu, doesn't matter, did not have a sense of law, order. They did not have any degree or sense of civility, religious pluralism, or aesthetics, or metaphysics, or philosophy, or science. So the white man's burden was to bring culture and civilization to this people, to the people of India, to people in Africa, to people in Southeast Asia. The Chinese, yeah, they were primitive in their understanding of the world. Yeah, they had some advances in agriculture and maybe in powder production and some other things, spices, etc., and maybe some construction business because they built the Chinese wall almost 2,000 years ago. But they lacked in what constitutes culture, civilization, aesthetics, civility, and other values. Therefore, the barbarians, in quotation marks, were extremely useful. Anyone who did not belong to the white man's club, that is white, Christian, European, suddenly became barbarian, primitive, savages. If you read the Enlightenment literature, especially in the 18th century, you see hundreds of pages written about this whole issue. Now, the use of barbarians, its function, was well captured in a poem by Konstantin Kavavis, a modern Greek poet who also lived in Turkey for many years, who had a house in Istanbul, where he describes a group of people, an empire, where everybody hears the word of the coming of the barbarians. And the bells are rang in the city, forces are mobilized, the emperor is informed. So everybody goes out to the outer limit of the city to confront these barbarians. But the city is restless. Everybody is concerned. They are stressed out. Who these people are? What will they do to us? What kind of barbarity and savagery they will bring upon our refined, cultural, civilized corners of the city? And suddenly, all the issues in the city that were real, such as unemployment, such as rival groups fighting each other, such as lack of services and things like that, were put aside. The whole empire came together against the threat of the barbarians. It comes to a point where the emperor sends out some scouts to make sure that these people are spotted, and they're followed so that the emperor and the army can take proper measures against these people. The scouts go out, they wait out in the open fields for days, and they see no sign of the barbarians. The word reaches the city and the emperor that there are no barbarians. No one is coming. And suddenly, Kawafis says, everybody gets very sad. And he ends his poem with this very striking line. He says, how can we now live without the barbarians? They were so useful to postpone our own problems. Now, today, every time you hear barbarians and savages and the primitive people and things like that, watch out for that comfort zone. That somebody is trying to create some kind of a barbarian somewhere to postpone a problem or an issue to project it to somewhere else. Now, the barbarians, however, do exist, not in the sense that empire and the emperor envision, or the Enlightenment thinkers envision the non-Europeans, the Africans, the Middle Easterners, or the Southeast Asians to be, but rather they came back in different forms. Now they live among us in the form of financial experts, so-called terrorism experts. They now live in the guise of security analysts, business executives, people who make decisions for the lives of millions of people without a shred of concern for their livelihood, for their economic conditions. People who dress up nicely, who drive expensive cars, who live in big houses, nevertheless carry that spirit of barbarity within themselves because they don't care about the value of human life. When people die from hunger, when millions of refugees are stranded in war zones, or they are left out in the cold, you see barbarity moving and living among us. Therefore, barbarians continue to live in the guise of modern dresses, modern institutions. When you have so much injustice in this world, when you have so much suffering, which can be avoided, majority of which can be avoided, you realize that actually the barbarians live among us in a different way. Now, civility in this context becomes, I think, an important element of our, or should become an important element of our thinking and fight against this form or forms of barbarity. Civility, in very simple terms, is to settle issues through reason, consent, and kindness. That is, you try to get what you want through reason. That is, you use your reason and try to convince the other side, not force or impose your will upon your counterpart, but reason with them. Do it, with subtlety. Do it with kindness and get their consent so that everyone can win. In this sense, civility is not a material thing like civilization. Civility is an attitude, it's a concept, it's a behavior, it's a way of approaching something, it's a way of dealing with things. It has very little to do with material conditions, your economic power, technological level, or military power. It is rather a concept, an idea, an attitude, a moral standing towards other human beings, but also towards other beings, such as the natural world. Civilization is, with its institutions, is the embodiment of the attitude of civility. Civilizations can come and go in terms of their material achievements, but the civility that exists within a society can express itself again in different forms. Civilization is the temporal and spatial embodiment, appearance of the different ways of being civilized towards other human beings, first of all towards ourselves, towards other human beings, and towards the world of nature. In that sense, civility entails but transcends the material world. It does not deny the reality of the material world, but it puts it in its proper place. It knows how to deal with the material world, whether it's the nature, whether it's manufactured stuff, whether it's the things that human beings create, but it just puts all these things in their proper place. So in this sense, civility is not bound, as I said, by economic power or technological advancement and the like. Rather, it is shaped and defined by an attitude of reason, consent, kindness, understanding. And in this sense, an African villager can be the most civilized person in the world. And a business executive in the Wall Street can be the most barbarian, uncivilized person in the world. It's about attitudes. It's about how you approach life, other human beings, how you value or not the lives of other human beings. Civility puts the spiritual and the material worlds in their proper place, I said. And I want to open up a parenthesis here and question an assumption that we usually have in the Muslim world, or rather in the Eastern world, in the non-Western world. When it comes to such civilized attitudes, people usually say that the West is materialist, the East is spiritualist, or spiritual. Therefore, we have the moral spiritual values which the West lacks. Therefore, if we can imbue and attach the spiritual moral values to the modern world, modern technological societies, I think we will reach a nice balance. I think that's a fallacious assumption. The reason is that, first of all, the line between the material and the spiritual is not as bold or as deep as people think. True spirituality doesn't deny the reality of the material world. We as human beings live in physical bodies. We create things with our hands by using materials to implement our ideals, to realize our ideas, to make life easier for other human beings, for ourselves, to exchange things, commodities, but also ideas. We do these things with material things. Material stuff does not necessarily mean being anti-spiritual. That's number one. Number two, well, today, there is as much materialism in the non-Western societies as there is spirituality in Western societies. There might be very nobly and honorably spiritual people in the highly advanced, industrialized Western societies, as there might be the worst form of, worst kind of materialists in Muslim cities, in Eastern African or Asian cities or Latin American cities. I think those lines have been blurred for a long, long time. But the key question here is not just simply to add some moral spiritual values and principles to this well-established, self-regulating, material, capitalist, profit-driven world. That will not solve any problem, any of the essential problems. What we need is a questioning of the total ecosystem of this world, where profit, use value, efficiency have become the most fundamental principles and values that define the value of our lives, the value of nature, and the value of human relationship. Whatever they produce economically, politically, technologically, only flow from this. We have to question the very basic assumptions on which this modern world of late capitalism functions. Without doing that, we will not cure any of the diseases that we see in the highly industrialized, technology-based or driven societies in which we live. In these societies where moderns have taken the role of the barbarians in terms of attitude, in terms of behavior towards other human beings, meaning and purpose have been reduced to use value. The meaning of something, the value of something is now defined by its use value. If it is useful for something, then it is meaningful. Therefore, everything is instrumentalized. Everything is turned into an instrument for something else. And that is the core of the problem. We lost the sense of the thing in itself, what Kant or the German philosophers call Ding an sich. That is the thing in itself, something that is valuable, meaningful, and has a purpose in and of itself, without any consideration for profit, for efficiency, for use value. Look at the way we approach nature. We are looking at the world of nature with our very advanced technological, scientific instruments, not to understand it anymore, but to control it. We believe now more and more, consciously or unconsciously, that we do everything to control the universe. We position ourselves as the masters of the universe because we have the ability to travel far into the space, to understand the material functioning of the world. We spend billions of dollars. We employ tens of hundreds of thousands of people to uncover the physical, material functioning of the world. We try to understand the Big Bang, how the world came about, how energy works, how we can utilize all this in order to control the universe. And those who position themselves as the masters of the universe are now moving in the direction of controlling other human beings. And when you, in terms of control, then you've lost the culture of civility, because you're turning other human beings and into instruments and reducing their value to use value. What's her use for me? What's his use value for me? This is the end result of the trap into which we have already fallen. That is, if you treat the world of nature in the way that we've been treating for the last 200 years or so, then we end up treating other human beings in the same way. We try to turn them into slaves because we want to use them. We don't see value in and of themselves, but rather we use them to maximize our profit, maximize efficiency. In this mindset, moral and spiritual and intellectual principles are treated as secondary values. The primary values, as I said, are use value, profit, maximization of profit, efficiency, interest, and the like. And this, of course, alienates us from the world of nature as well as from other human beings. The drive to control things becomes so fundamental, so deeply entrenched in our minds, in our souls, that we see practically no value in things over which we don't have control. We come to a point where, to use Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum, we begin to think in terms of I control, therefore I am. I understand so that I can control. The difference between control and being a friend, being a shepherd of something, of somebody, is that when you are the shepherd of existence, to use Heidegger's famous phrase, you take care of it. You take the responsibility to protect that thing. When you want to be the master of something, you want to possess that thing without taking any responsibility. The difference between being a shepherd and possessing something or somebody is so fundamental that it, in a sense, defines, if I may say so, the very definition of civility and barbarity in the modern world. Just concluding remarks, civility is very much enshrined in our terminology. The word city, which comes from the Latin word civitas, has the word civility in it. In Greek, it was police, polis rather, it meant the city. And the English word polite and politeness comes from the same root. Therefore, to be in a polis, in a city, means to be polite. But polite not in the sentimental sense of the term, but the intellectual, spiritual sense of the term that I try to define. And we have this very meaning in the word Medina, which used to be used, of course, for city in the Islamic languages. And the word civilization, tamaddun or madaniya, also comes from the same root. If you want to live as civilized people in the world in which we live right now, we have to remember this rich tradition of treating other human beings as well as the world of nature having a value in and of themselves, without instrumentalizing them, without reducing them to use value. Maybe then we will be able to recover that culture of civility and begin to think properly and treat other human beings, the world of nature, in the way they deserve to be treated.
Mashallah, thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim. You've given us so much to think of, so much to digest. Mashallah, I wish we had more time to engage with you. We'll start with the questions and answers session, and I have a couple of questions for you, Dr. Kalın. First of all, thank you very much for the honesty of bringing up the issue that we sometimes kind of create our version of barbarians to kind of blame our failures on the other, without also engaging with facing or like trying to deal with our own problems. This is usually not spoken of. And on that ground, I'd like to ask you, where did modernity go wrong, and where did we go wrong?
Wow, that's a big question, sister. I think modernity had some false assumptions from the very beginning, first of all. It was the result of a very unique experience in the Western intellectual and the social tradition. One of the, I think, mistakes was to universalize that experience to cover the rest of the world. That is Eurocentrism becoming the norm by which all other cultures and societies were defined. I mean, can you imagine a Chinese looking at the Western tradition and saying that, you know, now the new standards of knowledge, aesthetics, nobility, beauty, truth, all will come from a handful of Enlightenment writers. I mean, you know, someone coming from a tradition of 5,000 years, Chinese civilization, or for Africans who have had their own forms of culture and civility and civilization for centuries before the Europeans came to Africa as colonizers, and they were degraded, they were debased by the Europeans because they thought they were white and the black people were inferior, and they had no culture, nothing to show other than just dancing. You see how humiliating that is? But that mindset has got into our minds too. The way we read history, for example, is still so Eurocentric. We think that all philosophy, culture, science, everything began with the Greeks. That's not true at all. In fact, Greeks looked up to the ancient Egyptians as the place of culture and science and metaphysics, and all the great Greek philosophers from Plato to Parmenides, Pythagoras, and many others, in fact, either went to Egypt or learned from Egypt. And they always, you know, interestingly, Plato thought his period was the end of serious philosophy, not the beginning, because he thought the ancient sages, philosophers, lived centuries before them. Socrates certainly believed in that. And, you know, he always looked out to the Mediterranean, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamian, and other places. But now look at our thinking. You know, if you go to high school textbook or even at the university, we are taught that everything, you know, serious, important begins among the ancient Greeks. That's not true at all. You know, we are still yet to question some of these assumptions. Of course, number two, going overboard was another, I think, turning point in the history of Western modernity, where things got out of hand. being anti-church, anti-clerical, turned into anti-religion. And that, played a significant role in non-Western societies, where being modern came to be almost identified being anti-religion. The Christian, particularly Catholic Church experience in Europe cannot be generalized to non-Christian, non-Catholic, non-white societies, to Muslim societies or Chinese or African or Jewish societies. That was a very particular experience there. But it came to define again the very norms by which all these other cultures and histories and societies were defined. Ghazali, in his Mishkatul Anwar, explains a very deep and subtle philosophical point, where he says, if something overcrosses its boundary, it turns into its opposite. If something goes too far in one direction, then it becomes its opposite. And he gives this beautiful example of the sunlight. If you look at the sun with a naked eye, your eye is blinded. Sun becomes a black point in your eye because your eye has exceeded its limit of seeing things that are lit by sunlight. Meaning that if you exceed your limit, you turn into the opposite of what you're trying to do. With modernity, something similar happened, where they were trying to get rid of some of the excesses of the ecclesiastical tradition in Europe, in medieval Europe, where the church had become a huge political and economic power and lost its spiritual function. They went overboard and they threw the baby with the bathwater. And I think we have to understand, where did we go wrong? Again, I mean, that's a long question, but very briefly, we did, I think, two things wrong. Number one was to give up on our own tradition in the name of catching up with the bandwagon of modernity. If you want to modernize, give up on this, just throw this away. That's the only way, etc. That's number one. The other mistake was to close ourselves up to the rest of the world in the name of protecting our faith and tradition. These two extremes of closing down your mind, closing in on yourself, turns every tradition into a fossil. You begin to degenerate from within because you lose your vitality. Every culture and civilization remains vibrant as long as, or to the extent to which, it remains in interaction with other cultures and civilizations, whether in terms of exchange or challenges or interaction. The other extreme was, again, to open ourselves to any and every influence coming from somewhere. Then you end up your identity, you lose your tradition, your sense of where you belong. But we know that every great thing that happened in history in terms of ideas or cultures, civilizations, institutions, happen because that culture was rooted in its own soil. If you lose that soil, you become just a leaf being spread around, being pushed around by the wind, which may come from anywhere, and you lose yourself in that whirlwind. What you need is to be grounded in your own center without closing yourself up to the rest of the world. If you can strike this balance today, being rooted on the one hand and being open to the rest of the world on the other, I believe we can recover the best elements in our own tradition, face up to the challenges of the modern world, and create a space for ourselves in ways that I believe can be enriched extremely by our own faith and tradition.
MashaAllah, very wise. Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim. We have one of the questions asking about what is it that the role of the global South in trying to chart a new civility in a global humanistic sense that is shared for both without any divisions and separations, false separations between East and West.
You know, in agriculture, you have something called cross-pollination, where things, you know, kind of intermingle with each other, and that's where you have the highest degree of vibrancy and agricultural productivity, and things kind of remain organic, but also very highly productive. At this stage in our modern history, year 2021, I believe geographical, ideological, political fault lines, you know, have been overcome in so many different ways. This cross-pollination of different ideas and attitudes and traditions and memories can produce spaces of opportunity for us to address the pressing issues we have before our eyes, whether it's the refugees, whether it's the fight against terrorism or Islamophobia, the rising tide of populism, racism, economic inequality, injustice, and so many other larger issues. The key thing here is to know that we have something to say to the world. If Global South or others, Muslim world or the Chinese world, Africans or Latin Americans, I think it doesn't matter. We come together and look at these issues from a truly global point of view, putting aside our own ethno-religious, geographical priorities, and face all these issues and come together as human beings, just purely as human beings who have value in and of themselves without reducing them to use value. Then I think we can create a common story. We can shape that story together. And we know this fact, you know, in this world in which everything has become so intertwined with each other. I always say that we live in the age of butterfly effect, no longer the snowball effect. You know, in the age of the snowball effect, you can see the snowball coming from the mountain, from the hilltop, and you can kind of predict and calculate its momentum, its direction, its weight, because you see it's coming. You know, it will collect more snow, and you know, you will be able to predict it. But and it's more kind of a more mechanical process. But the butterfly effect is much more dynamic, multidimensional. Something that happens in one corner of the universe can affect so many other things in another part of the world. Just the fluttering of the wings of the butterfly, the effect it creates, can cause a tsunami in another part of the world. That is the butterfly effect. And our thinking must respond to this new reality of the butterfly effect age, where you have to think multidimensionally, you have to think in terms of so many different dynamics and contradictions, etc. But do it with a sense of reason, a proper use of reason, with a sense of humanity, refined character, kindness, mercy, understanding. One of the biggest losses we have had in the modern world has been to consider these values that I just mentioned, kindness, mercy, understanding, opening up to the other, as sentimental values devoid of intellectual content. More and more, we ran into this trap of treating faith in this sentimental way too. That is, I have faith, I cannot give maybe an intellectual explanation, but somehow my heart tells me that it's good to believe. You see, we are sentimentalizing our faith, our belief, our aqidah, our iman. The Islamic intellectual tradition never treated faith as a matter of sentimentality. That's why you have had this huge centuries long tradition of kalam debates and philosophy debates about faith, aqidah, where it is based, etc. Because faith is never devoid of cognitive content. But you have to know what you believe in. and you have to have justification and explanation for what you believe in. That's the reason, that's the hikmah for which you do something. I mean, that's a matter for another maybe discussion. But my point is that when you sentimentalize faith and moral values, you're bound to lose them. They lose their efficiency. They lose their relevance. They become so irrelevant, pale, weak, that all other forces trample them. And you basically lose their real value. So what we need to do, I believe, is to again recover this sense of the intellectual dimensions, spiritual dimensions of faith, morality, virtue, and take all this, go to the world. Islam is not a world-denying religion. You know, we don't run away from the material world. It's out there, we accept it. In fact, it is God's creation. It is the manifestation of God's beautiful names and qualities. Why should we run away from it? No. But when you put it in its proper place, material, that which we call material, in fact, becomes a conduit for us to reach the spiritual. It is through that material condition that we can reach the spiritual, the moral, the intellectual truth. So it's not to degrade the material world, to run away from it. No, to the contrary, go and deal with it, but do it in a proper way, in a way that will enrich the culture of civility.
Thank you very much. Well, I have a couple of questions that I can probably summarize in this question. What grounds for this civility can we find in our Islamic spirituality and Islamic philosophy that we could go back to kind of find those roots from which we can develop towards a new civility?
Civility, in the sense that I try to define, derives its justification not from my sentimental subjective ideas, but from the nature of things and the order of the universe. That's why, to give you an example, when Al-Farabi talks about the political order in his famous book, Al-Madinatul Fadila, he in fact devotes, the book is comprised of 19 chapters. He devotes the first 15 chapters to metaphysics, philosophy, cosmology, epistemology, spirituality, ethics, and then he talks about the political order, types of cities, etc. The reason he does this is, in fact, reflected in the title of his book. And the title of his book is Ara Ahl al-Madinat al-Fadila, Mabadi Ara Ahl al-Madinat al-Fadila, the principles of the views of the people of the virtuous city. So you have to explain what the principles are, Mabadi, what these principles tell you about the universe, about the structure of the world and the nature of things, how things come about, how existence, wujud, functions in all of this, causality and all of this. And then you have an understanding about how you should behave in all of this. Again, I don't have time to explain all this here, but very briefly, when you know that there is an order in the universe that you have to protect, and that order is independent of my subjective mental judgments, and it's an order to which I respond. It's not something that I create, something that I respond and I learn from. Then you begin to interact with the world of nature and with other human beings in a kind, humane way, without, again, turning this into something sentimental. It becomes an ontological function and a component of the world order. This is how, in fact, most traditions, not just Islamic, but also Christian, Jewish, African, Chinese, Buddhist, and Hindu traditions have dealt with the world of nature. You know, when you read Fariduddin Attar, his Mantiq al-Tayr, for example, the bird or the song of the 30 birds, I mean, you see this reflected, you know, in his poetry so remarkably. When you read the cosmological treatises of Ikhwan al-Safa, or you know, Ibn Sina or others, again, you find this reflected. When you read the stories of Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, you know, you find all of this. These are not, as I said, stories told to appease our emotions. They are stories told to point to some fundamental facts of the world order in which we live. just like the stories in the Quran. The stories in the Quran are told so that we learn lessons, we derive lessons from them. It's the same approach. They are not just some literary forms, but they rather reflect the very nature of things. Therefore, I think there is so much to recover from our own intellectual tradition, whether it's kalam or philosophy or Sufism or poetry. Believe me, it doesn't matter. As long as we understand the value of what it means to belong to a tradition and how to utilize it, then we can find so much in it. We cannot be lazy people sitting on top of this remarkable, rich treasure and then complain about not having a tradition. It's our work that we have to do. Our ancestors, our intellectual ancestors have done their work. They produced some of the greatest works in philosophy, science, art, theology, music, architecture, and spoken about the human condition and how human beings can connect with others, with God, how they create a culture of civility. It's our job now to learn to recover that tradition, bring it to the present, and help create a better world, not just for us, but for everyone.
MashaAllah. Thank you very much. We also have a couple of questions about meaning and value. Some of the people are asking, how do we find or how do we derive value and meaning, and how should we put it into perspective and make it useful to our work without falling into the the darkness of what is it? Relativity as well as nihilism.
Well, first of all, we have to take the question of meaning seriously. Don't assume that you have meaning in your life. You don't have meaning in your life until and unless you ask this question yourself, to yourself. What is the meaning of my life? What am I doing? What am I doing this for? Unless you ask this question, believe me, you have meaning in your life only potentially. You have to actualize it. So that's number one. Number two, meaning is something that I respond to, at least in my understanding. I create or I contribute to the elaboration of that meaning in my attempt, in my quest to bring that meaning out. But I cannot claim to be the creator of meaning on my own, because I know meaning comes about only at the intersection of my own subjectivity, myself as a person, as an individual, on the one hand, and the larger reality of which I am a part on the other. None of us are isolated islands. We live as part of a larger reality, and we respond to that reality. That reality is the fact that I've been created. That reality is the fact that I am part of a larger natural world. You know, biologically speaking, I'm not any different from a tree or from a cat, from a purely biological point of view, right? We all have DNAs and energy and blood and things like that. What makes me different from others is my quest for meaning, my thinking. So I respond to that call for meaning that is outside my mental constructions of reality. Thirdly, this quest for meaning is not something that is just abstract or some sort of mental gymnastics. It is real. It is existential. It is very fundamental. When you think about it and have reasons for the things that you are doing, then you have a chance to reach hikmah, because hikmah explains the reason for which you do something. When you look at the Quran, how Quran was revealed and how Prophet ﷺ taught the first Muslim community the very fundamental principles and teachings of Islam, it always explained the reason for which something should be done and then ask people to do it. You have to have belief in God, for example, in order to listen to God's order and commands. If you don't believe in God, right, it doesn't make any sense to say, well, this is the divine order, you have to follow it. If you don't know the reason why you should pray, you cannot pray. If you don't know the reason why you are expected to fast, you know, fasting doesn't do you any good. It's the reason for which you do something. It's that reason that gives you the meaning and purpose for anything that you do. In that sense, you know, in our tradition, hikmah has always preceded hukum. A hukum, a judgment in the religious, juridical sense of the term, is based on hikmah. Without explaining that wisdom, the purpose, the meaning for which you do something, you are never asked to do anything. We have to remember again, this subtle relationship between hukum, judgment, and hikmah, wisdom. The problem today is, and I've said this before, but I want to repeat it here again, there is so much judgment in our lives, but so little wisdom. We have to concentrate our minds again on finding the wisdom. And once we have the wisdom, then our judgments will become, again, more mature, reasonable, more humane. And those judgments will reach our minds as well as our hearts. And then hopefully we will become whole again.
And it's actually about your latest book, Açık Ufuk. We thought to ask, when is it going to be out in English? And second question, if you could give us the highlights or, yeah, the main highlights that you think can benefit us in this quest towards a new civility.
Well, thank you for mentioning my little book. I am honored, but I am also embarrassed and ashamed that, you know, I hope people don't perceive this as a little commercial here. Yes, the book is out in Turkish. I hope one day it will be available in English. The main purpose, my main purpose for writing this book was to evoke the sense of thinking in ourselves. It's really a book about why we need thinking, not mental gymnastics, not self-help type of meditation, but serious, profound thinking. Because without thinking, we are less than who we should be. Without realizing our intellectual potential, we cannot claim to be full human beings. The book is called Open Horizon because I believe in the balance between being rooted and having an open horizon. If I am simply being rooted with no horizon above my head, then I actually dig myself a big hole and live in that hole. That's not right. On the other hand, if I have just simply an open horizon with no roots, then I lose my own identity. And I believe we can strike a balance between the two. We can be rooted in our own tradition, culture, in our own soil, and open to the rest of the world, and benefit from what is out there. You know, God's universe is almost infinite. It's out there. And I always believe that one of the interpretations of the word Rabbul Alameen, which is repeated so many times in the Quran, is that God is the Lord, Allah is the Lord of so many different worlds, of maybe different human beings, different cultures, different societies, and perhaps different human beings, because each human is unique in his or her own way. Maybe each human is an alam, each culture is an alam, is a universe, and he is the Lord of all. And he is my Lord, and he is the Lord of all these other worlds, cultural, aesthetic, intellectual, spiritual worlds. And I don't see any reason why I shouldn't benefit and learn from those others. So I shall keep that horizon open. But I know where I'm rooted.